Welcome back to Physical Anthropology. In Chapter 12, we're going to be taking a look at modern Homo sapiens. So today's topics include identifying the skeletal traits of modern Homo sapiens, tracing the worldwide expansion of modern Homo sapiens, and then discussing the behavioral traits of modern Homo sapiens. So you've seen this chart before when we were comparing Homo erectus and the archaic Homo. What we're going to be focusing on today are those specimens which are considered to be anatomically modern. And so first of all, there's general patterns that you have been paying attention to, such as the increase in stature. So especially compared to something like Australopithecus, modern humans are taller. The decrease in sexual dimorphism, so that the males and the females are relatively the same size as opposed to the extreme differences that we saw in our ancestors. Also, we have a much more gracile skeleton. So our bones are thinner and more graceful looking than those of, for example, the Neanderthals and even that of Homo erectus. When we look at the cranium, our large brain size has created a very round shaped cranium with a large forehead. And of course, the brain size is about 1,400 cubic centimeters on average for modern humans. Most other older species are going to be smaller than that, with the exception of the Neanderthals, which did in fact have slightly larger brain sizes, but the shape of their brain was different from ours. So they had more brain matter in the back of their head in the occipital region than in the frontal area, which is what we consider to be important for decision-making, problem solving, and planning for the future. Another main pattern of difference is that because we changed our diet and we started cooking our food and eating softer foods, our tooth size has gotten smaller and our jaws have also gotten smaller. So in general, they're less prognathic, meaning they don't stick out. We have a flatter face and we have the appearance of that mental eminence, which is the chin. Okay, so we have a chin. Another interesting thing about that is that some people are continuing to evolve in such a way that our third set of molars, which are called our wisdom teeth, they usually don't erupt until you're a little bit older, maybe around 17, 18 years old, or even older than that. And some people don't get them ever in their life. So their wisdom teeth have completely ceased to exist, and they only have two sets of molars. In general, the cranium is also much smoother looking. So we have a smaller brow ridge and less bumps all over the skull because we don't need as much muscle attachment. So you've seen this before, the idea of three different theories on where modern humans came from. So hopefully remember there's the out of Africa model, which stated that when the Homo sapiens expanded out of Africa, they did not interact with any of their archaic relatives. There's the multi-regionalism theory, which stated that after Homo erectus left, the modern day Homo sapiens evolved from them, but on all the different continents simultaneously. And then, of course, the most accepted model, the assimilation model, is that there's a combination of these things. We did, in fact, evolve first in Africa, so there's a lot of evidence for that. But when we left Africa, we would interbreed with other hominin species that we came across that were closely related to us. So, for example, in the chart on the bottom right, we know that there's actually some interbreeding between the archaic Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals in Europe, as well as the more modern Homo sapiens that would have been migrating out of Africa and then also reaching Europe at a later time, and in Asia and Africa as well. One thing I did want to point out is that in some situations, we actually consider Neanderthals to be a subspecies rather than a separate species of human, in which case we would classify them as Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, and then modern day humans would be called Homo sapiens sapiens. This would imply a very close relationship and the ability to interbreed without that hybrid infertility that we've discussed in previous lessons. The problem, of course, with that is it's difficult sometimes to find out this information with only fossils. And so more DNA evidence is needed, but there was definitely some interbreeding. Whether it was extensive or not is unclear at this point. So the map on the top left shows the presence of Homo erectus on several different continents You may recall they were the first hominin to actually leave Africa. So they are found in Asia and Europe, and also in the Southeast Asian islands. However, they never made it to the Americas, and they didn't go to Australia either. Modern Homo sapiens, on the other hand, are found all over the world. And you can see some of these migration patterns on the bottom right. So we are going to see the expansion from Asia all the way down to Australia and the various Pacific islands. We're also going to see crossing over from Asia to the Americas, first to North America and then down to South America. There is DNA evidence that we are able to use to help figure out these migration patterns. And one of the most interesting, I think, is something called mitochondrial Eve. So when we look at DNA across people, we often use nuclear DNA. But one thing that we've done that's kind of a unique, different situation is looking at mitochondrial DNA. So mitochondria is something that is inherited from the mother only. And that's because it's an organelle found in the cell, and it's going to be in the egg cell. The sperm does not contribute mitochondria to the zygote. And for this reason, if you look at an individual person's mitochondria, it will have similarities to their mother, but not to their father. So you can use this to trace maternal lineage. And what we mean by that is we could compare your mitochondria to your mother, and then your mother's mother, and your mother's mother's mother, and so forth, all the way back that one distinct line. So when we do this across different people from various continents, what we have found is that the mitochondria and the changes in the mitochondria indicate that we all share a common ancestor. So all of humanity shares a common female ancestor that lived in Africa about 150,000 years ago. So that's really interesting. Now remember that this would only be one specific path backwards. So it doesn't show, for example, your father's mother, because you would never have inherited mitochondrial DNA from her. An alternate path of getting DNA evidence is from the Y chromosome. So the Y chromosome is only inherited through the paternal line. So in this case, you could look at a male and you could look at his Y chromosome, and this would be compared to his father, and then his father's father, and father's father's father, and so forth. And this also shows us evidence that there's a common male ancestor about 120,000 years ago, also from Africa. So there's a lot of evidence showing that, yes, in fact, we did start off in Africa and then migrated to these other continents. There is something called the Southern Dispersal Model that specifically explains how we crossed the Red Sea to get over to Asia. So how did we get to North America? A couple of interesting things that were happening is that at this time period, there was an ice age. And when there's an ice age, because so much water is trapped in ice, the ocean levels are lower than normal. And what we currently see is there's something called the Bering Strait, which is in between North America and Russia, okay, so the continent of Asia. But that strait would have been landmass at the time of the Ice Age. And so it would be possible to physically cross it without swimming or using boats. So there's a couple different theories on how the people who were in Asia migrated over to North America. There's something called the ice-free corridor model, which basically says that it was possible to cross over there because there were glaciers and there was land mass in between them. But this has been modified since then. So we now think that most likely people didn't cross like right here in the middle. Instead, they probably followed the coastline. So they followed the coastline because there would have been more food along the coastline. So that's the coastal route model. In addition to that, there's been even more modifications saying that there's this kelp highway. The idea that if you were walking across the coast, what you would use for your food source would be these marine life organisms that live in the kelp, whether that's shellfish or sea urchins or anything like that. Basically, that's what you would be using to get your nutrients. So that's the modification of that coastal route model. And then in addition to that, we have the Beringia standstill model saying that as these people migrated across this landmass, there was going to be very little gene flow between them and their Asian ancestors. So they would have been evolving as they were, isolated in this area. And in fact, we do still have in this area in Canada and Alaska, we have the Alaskan Inuits, which are their own ethnic group who have been there now for thousands of years. So when did all of this happen? We're talking about at least 20,000 years ago would have been the first migration across, but there were probably several different migration events. It wasn't just one group of people who came to North America and that was it. Instead, Some people migrated across to North America, and then some people might have migrated back to Asia. So there was possibly, migration events, multiple introductions of new DNA to this continent of North America. Now, once North America was populated, so there would have been, different groups all across North America, some of these individuals did continue down through Central America, all the way down to South America. So that took a little bit longer, because this is quite a long distance to follow, but eventually even South America was populated. Then the second map on the bottom right, this is showing what's going on with Polynesia, which is really interesting. So all of these different islands, we know that people were able to leave the islands and raft across to some of these other really, really tiny islands, like for example, here's Hawaii. But that is a very recent event. So you can see this happened in 980. That means only a little over 1,000 years ago. While some of the other ones here, like 1300 BC, 1500 BC. So these islands have only been inhabited for a couple thousand years at the most. In comparison, the continent of Australia, so there's Australia, has been populated since about 50,000 years ago. And these would have been the ancestors of the modern day indigenous group of Australia, who are called the Aboriginal people. And again, how did they get across? Probably the water levels were lower at that time period, but there would still have been water between Southeast Asia and Australia. So they would have had to use some kind of raft or flotation device to get there. So now that we've established what makes us modern humans in terms of our skeleton and how we got to all these different places around the world, let's look at changes in our culture and behavior. So now with more modern humans, what we're going to see is a lot more material culture. We saw even with the Neanderthals that there was burial and that there were burial gifts provided to that individual, things like tools or weapons. But with modern humans, we get a lot more. And so we're getting more and more evidence of changes in the culture. One really cool new thing that we're going to see is the appearance of art. So basically the creation of these abstract designs and artistic symbols. One example would be sculptures. So this picture right here is of a female figure that's quite common in these early human Homo sapiens, where they would create a female figure which may or may not have represented some kind of fertility ritual, because the females often look quite pregnant, and they have breasts and large bellies that kind of indicate what you would expect a pregnant woman to look like. We also see more sophisticated tools. So yes, there are definitely still stone tools, but we start seeing the appearance of bone tools. And bone tools can be carved in many more ways than stone can. So they're a little bit more flexible in their design. And we see some unique new weapons like the addle. So in the picture right here with this gentleman, this is a modern day gentleman holding the tool, but basically the addle is this structure right here. What it is a device to help throw a spear. So this wooden device, what you do is you put in this long shaft of a spear, and before this was invented, the spear would have to be thrown by hand. And there's only so much force and power that a person can put into it. You're limited by your own muscles and bones and strength. But what this addle does is it gives this extra leverage so that when this is pushed forward, basically pushed forward in an arc, it takes this spear. And this spear in this picture does not have a stone tip, but you could put a stone or bone tip right there, and you would be able to hurl this spear really, really far away due to that extra leverage. We also see the beginning eventually of things like pottery and baskets. Obviously, baskets aren't going to preserve very well in terms of archaeological material, but pottery definitely will. And then we also see art in the form of paintings. So this is really neat. In Europe, we have found several caves that are filled with cave art. And the first one is dated between 31,000 and 26,000 years ago, the different artwork that was produced by separate groups of people. So it was used multiple times throughout human history. And what we see there are depictions of animals, possibly animals that were being hunted or animals in the environment at that time. We also see human figures. And we also see sometimes various types of geometric designs, things like zigzags and circles, dots, those also appear. Lascaux Caves is another location in France. That one dates to 17,000 years ago. Now, how did the individuals create these designs? They could have used something like charcoal for the black designs, and they would have used a pigment that comes from ochre, which is a type of stone, and it can be pounded into a powder and create a couple different types of pigments like yellowish, orangish, brownish, reddish pigments, and those could be used to paint these different artistic creations. Okay, so next big change in human history is going to be how we changed our way of obtaining food. Now, there are certainly still nomadic lifestyles and nomadic cultures in the world today, but they're not very common anymore. So the nomadic lifestyle would have been much more common in our ancestors because they were hunter-gatherers. And so when you're a hunter-gatherer, you're going to be foraging. That means you have to go throughout your landscape to find whatever kind of food you can find. So you may go to different areas based on what plants are flowering, what fruit is available and ripe at that season. You'd also be looking at animals to hunt, and you may follow them due to their migration patterns. So you wouldn't really be storing food for long term. There wasn't really much way of storing food anyway. It's not like we had refrigerators back then. You could dry out your food. Okay, so you'd be living off of things like jerky, beef jerky. You could also try to salt them if you had access to salt, which not everyone would have. That would be more if you were along the coast or if you could trade for it. But in general, we had to get fresh food a lot of the times. And what happens is if you stay in one location, eventually you're going to hit something called carrying capacity. That means that there's a certain limit to how many organisms can survive in that environment. So if you're hunting all the game and you're picking all the fruit and you're eating all the nuts, and there's hundreds of people living in that one location, eventually you're going to run out of food. So you have to move to a new location. And this was really, really common. So nomadic lifestyles were the norm. Now, eventually, about 100,000 years ago, sorry, actually, that shouldn't be 100. This should be at 10,000 years ago. So about 10,000 years ago, we see the switch to agricultural lifestyle. The idea of agriculture is that we are going to be planting our own plants and fruit to harvest. And then we're also going to be domesticating animals so that when they are large enough, we can use them for meat or potentially use them for other animal products such as milk. And that we're no longer going to be foraging, we're no longer going to be migrating from area to area. So when you develop agriculture, it creates a sedentary lifestyle. That means you have to stay in place because it takes time for the plants to grow. They have to be constantly taken care of, whether it's watering them or weeding them or getting rid of pests. And that takes a lot of energy and time. It can take, weeks or months before you can harvest the food. But the benefit is that now you have guaranteed food. So you can actually produce a lot more food through agriculture than you can through hunting and gathering lifestyles. What this means is that we're going to see extreme population growth, and we're going to start seeing urban centers where people are going to congregate around areas where agriculture is possible and where it's easy to grow these plants. We're also going to see, changes in jobs, which, before that, it's not like people had necessarily jobs, but they may have had different roles in their group. But now we're going to see specialization due to the fact that just a few people could be responsible for producing the food for the entire community. And so now other people can focus on different tasks. There are some negative consequences of agriculture as well, which we'll talk about more in a different lesson. But due to these diet changes, we're going to see some negative health effects in our people. We're also going to see the rise of certain infectious diseases. Some types of things like dental cavities become more common. We actually don't see that many dental cavities, or dental caries is the other term for that. We don't see that so often in our older fossils. But in the more modern humans, definitely we start to see that with the advent of agriculture. We also see something called malocclusion, which is changes in the jaw due to the soft diets that are becoming more common. So some review questions for you. Chavaux and Lascaux in France are two sites famous for what? So that is where we have found quite a few pieces of evidence for cave art. The mineral-based pigment called blank was used by early modern Homo sapiens to color many artifacts and features. So hopefully remember it was a stone called ochre. What was the new hunting technology developed during the Upper Paleolithic? So you may remember that we started to switch to bone tools, but in addition to that, rather than just our spears and axes, we get the atlatl. And this here is an agricultural timeline for you. You can read it in more detail, but basically the earliest evidence of agriculture from Mesopotamia, as I said, is a little over 10,000 years ago. That's in the Middle East, and there was a lot of evidence of different types of grains being grown there, as well as our first domestic animals such as cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats. Now, agriculture actually appeared in multiple locations across the globe independent of each other. So we think that, for example, in Southeast Asia, these people developed agriculture on their own. They didn't learn it from the Mesopotamians, but they were growing things like rice and soybeans, and they also had pigs as well as chickens. Then if you move on to the Americas, we do have in central Mexico the development of maize. So maize you might be more familiar with as corn, but the corn that we eat today is very different from the original grass that it was domesticated from. In South America as well, we see things like potatoes, which are now a staple across the world. And then some interesting animals that live there, because this is up in the mountains, would be llamas, alpacas, and guinea pigs. Africa developed a little bit later, more like 5,000 years ago, but they also have various types of grains as well as cattle. And then finally, in Eastern North America, we see things like squash and sunflowers. And that wraps it up for chapter 12.